At my graduation dinner, my father pushed transfer papers across the table and told me to sign for my sister, as my mother called it family duty. I set my diploma on top and said no, and he tore it in half in front of the room. What they did not know was that HarborShield AI was already a Delaware C Corp with bylaws that block forced transfers, a license from MIT confirmed in my inbox, and a living trust co-signed by my grandmother. By 11 the next morning, we would close our $2 million pre-seed, and by noon the board would be real. When my sister later claimed she was my co-founder, I took an evidence pack and a camera crew to my grandmother's study and let the papers talk. My name is Nora Bennett, and this is how I protected my company and learned that saying no can save more than pride. I pulled the envelope closer and saw the words assignment of intellectual property and transfer of founder shares. My name in tidy serif type. Avery's name waiting in an empty field, as if my work had always been meant to end up there. The world narrowed to a point. I thought about the months of coding in the stale air of the computer lab, the late buses back to Cambridge, the way my hands used to shake after too much coffee and not enough sleep, and how every line of code had become a promise to I myself. Avery smiled at me with the kind of smile she wore for photos. She said she had talked to people who could fix my little company, that it would be better for everyone if she took over. She touched the gold watch on her wrist as if it were a seal of authority. Dad said he and Mom had already discussed it, and this is what made sense. He said my sister had real business experience and that my season behind a screen had taught me valuable technical skills, but not how the world worked. I set the envelope aside and placed my diploma folder on top of it like a paperweight. I told them my company was already a Delaware C Corp and that our bylaws limited transfers. I said any sale of founder shares required board approval and that our investors held rights of first refusal. I told them an assignment of my intellectual property to any person outside the company would contradict the license agreements we had in place. My voice stayed even because the words were facts, not arguments, and facts made a safe floor under my feet. My father's jaw worked while I spoke. He asked who gave me permission to hide behind paperwork from my own family. My mother murmured that sacrifices are what make families strong. Avery said she had been in meetings before and knew how leadership really functioned. I reminded them that I had founded HarborShield AI to protect small businesses from being tricked by the kinds of emails that make owners lose sleep. I reminded them that I had spent nights debugging on my laptop at the kitchen counter while they argued in whispers about Avery's next idea and where to find the money for it. I told them I would not sign anything that handed my work to someone who had never opened the repository, never stared at a stack trace until her eyes watered, never apologized to a pilot customer for a false positive at 3 in the comms. Morning. Avery laughed under her breath and said I was being dramatic. She said no one would know the difference once she took over and polished the brand. She said a woman with real presence could get the press, and that there were friends of hers ready to join once this transfer made things official. My mother nodded along and told me everyone would be happier when this nonsense was behind us. The server approached to refill our water and backed away when he felt the temperature at our table. A family at a corner banquet stopped in the middle of telling a story to watch. I could hear the clink of forks and the hum of graduation pride all around us, every other table wrapped in bright, predictable joy. My table was something else. It was a test I had seen coming for months, something I had prepared for the way you prepare for a storm by checking the windows twice. I opened the diploma folder and looked at my name in calligraphy. I let my fingers press into the heavy paper to remind myself it was real. Dad said stop stalling. He told me to sign and stop making a scene. His voice got that slow, careful tone that meant he believed I did not understand the stakes. He said Avery's last venture had not been a failure, just ahead of its time, and that a family should invest where the upside is greatest. He said I owed it to them to help her. I told him I was not refusing to help anyone. I was refusing to break the law and betray my team and our investors by pretending my company was a toy that could be handed across a dinner table. I said the board had to approve any change in control and that we had protective provisions meant for exactly this kind of pressure. I said I would not risk the company's future or the livelihoods of the customers we were already protecting. Avery rolled her eyes and said I could stop with the corporate talk. She said if I really cared, I would show good faith and sign the papers to prove I put family first. My mother leaned in and whispered that I should not ruin a beautiful day with stubbornness. She reminded me of the kid I used to be, quiet in my room, careful, obedient. She said I was always the sensible one. The word sensible felt like a label someone else had pressed to my forehead. I looked at Avery, and I looked at my mother, and then at my father, who was breathing through his nose in that way that always meant an ultimatum was coming. I told them I loved them and that I had always tried to be a good daughter. I told them being good did not mean giving away the only thing I had built with my own hands. I said I could not and would not sign. My father reached for the diploma folder and pulled it from my hands. He said if I thought a piece of paper made me better than my own family, then I was sorely mistaken. He told me I had forgotten who paid the mortgage and who guided us through hard times. He lifted the certificate out and there was a sharp ripping sound like a small flag tearing, and the table went very quiet. Half of my name hung from his fingers. A couple at the next table gasped. The server dropped a spoon. The room seemed to tilt. For a heartbeat, I felt 12 again, standing in the kitchen while adults argued in circles above my head. Then the feeling passed and the present returned. I reached out and took both pieces from him gently and slid them back into the folder. The paper would tape. My future did not need his permission to exist. My mother whispered that this was for my own good. Avery said I was being ungrateful and short-sighted and that real success required decisive moves. She said she was the only one among us who had the stomach to lead. The certainty in her tone would have sounded impressive if I had not spent 3 years watching her certainty burn through credit limits while my code tried to become something useful. I stood up. The chair legs scraped the tile and that sound cut through the soft music from the speakers. I told them I was not signing. I told them we were done discussing it. I said I would not be pressured into a violation that could damage my company and expose me to liability. I said I wished things were different, that we could celebrate like the families around us, but we were not those people tonight. My father said if I walked out I would make a fool of him. My mother said we should talk in the car, that we should not embarrass ourselves. Avery crossed her arms and said go, then run back to your laptop and your little system and see how far you get without us. She said I would come back when it all fell apart. The air smelled like butter and grilled fish and something sweet cooling in the kitchen. A graduation party on the other side of the room started to sing quietly to their grandmother. I picked up my bag, placed the ruined diploma folder on top of the envelope I had refused to touch, and pushed the envelope back across the table so it rested in front of my father again. I told him I hoped he would not try this with me again. I told my mother I would always love her. I told Avery I hoped she found something that was hers and that she treated it better than she treated other people's work. I walked past the bar and heard a sports recap on the television, words about a come-from-behind win and a rookie who had kept his cool under pressure. A couple of recent graduates in gowns clinked glasses and told each other you did it. The door opened and the night air felt new against my face, like a clean page that no one else had touched. Kendall Square hummed with the afterglow of the day, motorbikes rioting down the avenue, the tea rumbling under the sidewalk, the kind of Boston evening that feels like a promise in late spring. I stood there a moment and let my shoulders drop. I thought about the board consent already on file, the rights of first refusal spelled out in careful clauses, the license from MIT recorded in my inbox, the people counting on me to be steady. I thought about Harborshield AI and the first diner owner who had trusted a student with a problem bigger than any pop quiz. I felt the sting of the torn diploma and the steadier heat of relief that follows when a boundary holds. My phone buzzed on silent with a string of messages I did not open. I kept walking. The brick and glass around me caught bits of light and I followed them toward the street where the buses sipped passengers and set them down like gifts in the places they chose. I did not hurry. There was no need to run. I had already decided who I was going to be tonight. Mia opened our door before I reached for the knob, and her eyes scanned my face the way a medic checks a pulse. "You kept your head," she said. "Good. Tea or coffee?" She had already set a kettle on the stove, and the apartment smelled like lemon cleaner and something vanilla from the candles she always lit on heavy days. Dylan sat cross-legged on the rug with his laptop surrounded by sticky notes that looked like small flags claiming territory. He lifted a hand without looking up. "I am in the console," he said. "No smoke, no fire. We are green across the board." I dropped my bag on the chair by the window and felt my shoulders catch up with the rest of me. The night out there looked like a sheet of black glass. Inside, the living room hummed with quiet machines and the soft clack of keys. I told them what had happened in a handful of sentences and kept out the worst parts because some hurts grow if you hold them up to the light. Dylan paused long enough to say sorry, then he was back in the tunnels of the cloud where his mind lived half the time. Mia handed me a mug and bent toward the coffee table where a color-coded media grid sat beside a stack of printed talking points. "We run the release at noon if we close in the morning," she said. "I will seed the local business reporters first and hold the national tech outlets until the case study lands. Serena is fine with a staged rollout." She tapped a square labeled social assets and then looked me in the eye. "You are not alone in this, Nora. We stick to facts. We keep it clean." Facts were the only thing that made me feel safe. I set the mug down and told them we would do a final walkthrough of the plan and then a full system check. I needed everything ready for whatever the morning wanted to throw. Mia nodded and started a rehearsal without calling it one. She read the short summary of HarborShield AI in a voice that was steady without being stiff. Small businesses, deceptive emails detection at the edge, guided verification, results in plain language. She did not say the word hero, and I loved her for it. Dylan cleared his throat and recited our operational state. Keys rotated last week. Certificates renewed. Backups tested yesterday night. The cluster has surplus capacity and the monitoring is dialed to alert at the first sign of lag. He looked up from the graph on his screen. "You sleep and I will babysit the logs. If anything twitches, I will call." As we settled into the small rhythm of checking boxes, my head did what it always does before the stakes rise. It ran the tape backward as if to confirm we had built the road under our feet. Sophomore year, I took a part-time job at a bakery in Central Square and watched the owner come in with a face like he had not slept. He had wired a deposit to a fraudster who had cloned a supplier invoice. That night, I went home and sketched the bones of a system that would not let him hurt like that again. A year later, I stood in a cramped meeting room with a folding table and pitched a professor on a research project that would make sense of language patterns and sender histories and gnarly metadata. He said if I wanted to make it a life instead of a paper, I needed to think like a builder. By January of 2025, we had filed the papers in Delaware and HarborShield AI became a C Corp you could draw on a cap table. We issued restricted founder shares, and I signed the assignment of inventions. Leah drafted the bylaws with the right of first refusal and the protective provisions that would later save my skin when my own family decided my company should be a dinner table asset. I mailed the 83B election with a stamp I pressed like a prayer, and then I kept working. In March, the license from the technology office at the Institute came through with its tidy seals, and we celebrated with greasy pizza and bad music at the apartment, all of us yelling the lyrics and none of us on key. Mia nudged me back to now with a gentle tap on the page where the talking points ended. "We need 3 human details," she said. "Not cute." "True." She gave me examples. Late-night bug fix with a pilot texting in panic. A diner owner who cried relief and then sent us cinnamon rolls. The email from a customer who said they slept for the first time in a month. I told her about Cassandra in Worcester and the way her voice shook when she realized she had not sent money to a thief. "That one," Mia said, and circled a line. We moved to the whiteboard by the bookshelf where we kept our world tacked up in erasable ink. Dylan drew 3 rectangles for the 3 pilot customers and filled them with the same methodical care he used to diagram network flows. Diner. Pet grooming shop. Hardware store. He wrote their names and the go-live dates we had confirmed. He wrote the contact at each place and the exact alert thresholds. He wrote shared risks and mitigation in small tidy letters, and for a second I felt like I was looking at a chapel wall where someone had painted our hopes in a line of saints. Prof. Ruth is speaking at the summit next month, Mia said, and she will do a short nod to our research if the organizers allow it. That is good for credibility, but not the headline. You are the headline because the product works. She tilted her head. Also because of what happened tonight. People smell blood from a mile away, and some will circle for sport. We give them nothing to feed on. I let out a breath I had not realized I was holding and sat on the arm of the couch. There is something I should tell you, I said. Something I set up after the first argument back in winter, when Dad started hinting that Avery could be useful if she had a stake. Mia stopped writing, and Dylan closed his laptop a notch like a book leaning into a nap. I told them about the trust. I said a portion of my founder shares had been placed into a living trust with my grandmother as co-trustee. I said I had made the decision after Leah explained how a simple legal structure could keep personal pressure from becoming corporate risk. My grandmother had signed the documents with a pen that used to belong to my grandfather, and she had cried and then laughed and then put her hands on my cheeks and called me her steady girl. Mia smiled around the edges, and Dylan said that is elegant in a way that makes me jealous. It does not block me from voting my other shares, I said. It just means a cousin with opinions cannot force my hand with a guilt trip. It means what happened tonight has fewer doors to slither through. Mia pointed to the section in the media plan labeled questions we will not answer and added family finances in thick letters. She said we speak only in systems language and outcomes. We will not share the trust. We will not speak to tabloids. We will not litigate feelings in public. If pressed, we say the company follows the law and protects its customers, and that is the news. I stood and stretched. The apartment creaked the way Boston apartments creak when a heavy day finally sits down and the old wood remembers itself. The kettle clicked off again, and Mia poured more hot water over the same tea leaves because this was not a night to fuss over small luxuries. Dylan propped his laptop on the coffee table and showed me that our staging environment had cleared its health checks like a runner breathing free air. We ran a tabletop of the morning like paramedics practicing for a mass casualty drill. Serena calls at 8. We meet at the office at 10. Legal brings the signature packets and I sign next to a blossom of initials. The release goes out afternoon. Leah reviews the investor rights agreement. I ask 2 questions about board mechanics, so we have them on record. Mia sends a note to Dana to confirm the interview at my grandmother's house. We list what we will carry. Evidence pack in a sturdy envelope. 2 copies of the bylaws. A printed page with the caps table as of today. The confirmation email from the technology office. A spare charger. A water bottle. These were things to do, and doing has always been my way out of fear. It grew late. The adrenaline that had held me rigid in the restaurant began to ebb, and my body wanted sleep like a child wants its mother. I washed my face in the small bathroom and saw the faint line where the cap had pressed against my skin, a reminder that this day had started with a walk across a stage and applause that had felt too loud. I changed into a t-shirt and socks, and when I came back, Mia had flipped the couch blanket over so the soft side faced up. Dylan looked like a statue who had just remembered how to breathe. I will leave the logs on my phone, he said. I am not going far. He jerked his chin toward the window. I can circle the block if my brain needs it. Mia put her palm over my hand the way you calm a skittish horse. You did the hard right thing tonight, she said. Tomorrow you do the next hard right thing. Then we tell the story the way it deserves to be told. I lay down and listened to the bones of the building creak and the distant hiss of a bus exhaling at a stop. Sleep came and went in small waves, and in between them I saw code flowing like a river and lines of text that said things I could not hear in my waking life. Once I dreamed my diploma became a white flag, and then it turned into a sheet of paper with columns of numbers, and my grandmother signed it with that old pen and said, "Carry on." When I sat up, the room had thinned into the stretch of hours that live between night and morning. The city was quiet in the way cities get quiet when they know they must wake early. I slid my feet to the floor and the wood was cool and good. I checked my phone without opening any messages from home. An email from Leah time-stamped before midnight said the signature sequence was confirmed and the documents were queued. Another from Serena offered a calm line about logistics and flexible timing if we needed it. My pulse slowed a notch. I brewed fresh coffee even though Mia would tease me for not finishing the tea. Dylan stirred and gave me a lazy salute. The sky over the river was beginning to think about light. I stacked the evidence pack in my bag and felt the weight of it reassuring and ordinary like books for a test you actually studied for. Mia emerged with her hair in a knot and wrote on the whiteboard in quick strokes. Close. Announce. Prepare. The world outside our window shifted from black to a deep blue that carried the first hint of day. Somewhere out there a bakery would be turning on its ovens and a diner would be cracking eggs and a hardware store owner would be flipping a sign from closed to open. I took one long breath and held it and let it out slow. The morning waited for us not like a verdict but like a door we were already holding the key to. We were at the curb with our bags before the first bus hissed by and the air had that thin early chill that wakes your nerves in a clean line. Mia locked the apartment and tucked the media plan into my tote. Dylan walked beside me with his laptop hugged to his chest like it had a pulse. Back Bay rose ahead of us in glass and stone, the kind of morning that makes office towers look like quiet ships waiting for their crews. Granite Harbor's lobby was all marble and measured light. Serena Whitfield met us by the security desk with a half smile that said, "Good morning, and also we are working." She moved like a runner at the blocks. Her hand touched my elbow just enough to anchor, then she led us into a conference room with a view of roofs and the ribbon of Commonwealth Avenue. A tray of coffee sat untouched. On the wall, a screen showed a checklist with all the calm of a grocery list. Licenses. Security procedures. IP chain of title. Serena said we would do one last pass. She said no drama and no surprises is what we want. Her associate slid a laptop across and said we would run through their standard diligence script for software. Dylan was already in our repository mirror. He spoke in a steady cadence that always steadied me. Software bill of materials generated, dependencies flagged. Third-party licenses mapped to SPDX identifiers. He glanced up and Serena nodded. Go on. We walked line by line. He pointed to permissive licenses and our compliance posture. He showed our acknowledgements file and the open source notice we would ship with the next update. He kept it dry, almost boring, which is exactly how Risk wants to sound when you are doing it right. Then his finger slowed on the trackpad and his eyes narrowed. There was a library name that looked familiar in the way a wrong note looks familiar. He said he needed to double-check the license version. A minute stretched. He opened the manifest from an older branch, the one I had told him to keep for historical testing, and there it was. A dusty dependency with a GPL license attached to an old prototype. Not in the current release path, but present in the attic of our codebase where an overeager scanner could pretend it mattered. Dylan said potential copyleft risk from a dead branch. Not linked into production. Still, we should excise to avoid false flags. Serena did not frown. She did not smile either. She asked how long it would take to make the issue disappear in both substance and appearance. I told her we had an internal implementation waiting in a feature branch because I never trusted that library. I said I could swap it now, remove the old branch, and update the SBOM. Her associate set a timer on his phone without being dramatic. Dylan slid the laptop so it faced me, and I opened a terminal like a pianist sits at the keys she knows best. Hands remember what minds doubt. I checked out the clean branch merged. The internal module ran the tests with my jaw relaxed because this was muscle memory. Coverage held. No regressions. I pruned the dusty branch and ran the scanner again. Dylan watched the progress bar like a sunrise. He said clear. He reran his generator and pointed to the list. No GPL in the tree. He pushed the updated bill of materials to the diligence folder and looked to Serena like a student meeting a teacher's eyes after solving a problem at the chalkboard. Serena's shoulders dropped half an inch. She thanked us without flourish and moved to the next item. Security procedures. She asked about key rotation and incident response. Dylan showed the schedule in our secrets manager and the rotation logs from last week. He pulled up the incident playbook Mia and I had written on a rainy night in April when fear had made us thorough. He explained our notifications ladder and the page that lived above his bed in case of the kind of midnight that shakes you out of sleep. Then came IP chain of title. Leah arrived with a thin folder and that courthouse calm she wears like a coat. She shook Serena's hand and set a printed packet on the table. Assignment of inventions signed at incorporation. Flow-down language in all contributor agreements. A copy of the license from the technology office sent in March with a note that an updated confirmation would be reissued today. Leah said the licensing officer at the Institute, Janet Mills, had emailed a draft note to confirm that the official version would arrive in our inboxes before lunch. She held up her phone and we all saw the subject line like a lighthouse shape. Harbor Shield license confirmation. Leah said this is routine and Serena said routine is our friend. Prof. Ruth joined by video and waved the way she always does like a neighbor leaning over a fence. She was in an office with books stacked in a way that made me itch to tidy them and she held up a letter on letterhead. The letter summarized the novelty of our approach laid out in simple language that made complex ideas respectful rather than showy. She spoke briefly about how building something that helps small businesses check their mail for lies is good science that touches actual life. Serena asked 2 clean questions about academic encumbrances, and Prof. Ruth said there were none, then wished us a good close and signed off with a small salute. The associate asked about our penetration testing schedule. Dylan explained that for a company at our stage we used a combination of third-party scanning and internal red team exercises. He showed a report with findings resolved and a ticket board that did not lie about its scars. Mia walked through our policy for handling customer data in pilot environments. She kept it crisp and human. She said no one wants a lecture when they are scared, they want a hand on the rail and steps they can follow. Serena smiled at that and wrote down the phrase hand on the rail. There was a silence that felt like the inside of a held breath. Serena closed her notebook and aligned it with the edge of the table. She stood and looked out at the city as if the skyline were a graph she was reading. Then she turned back to us. She said this was the kind of morning that tells you a team can take a punch without flinching. She said the extra pass did what it was supposed to do. She asked if we had any questions before she made the call. I asked about board mechanics because I wanted the answers spoken in the room. Serena said after the close there would be 2 voting seats, one held by me and one by the fund, and an independent observer seat without a vote until our next round. She described reserved matters and the threshold for certain decisions, and Leah nodded along because the language matched the documents. Mia scribbled notes even though she already knew what Serena would say. Dylan looked relieved to be back on a topic where people do not mistake diligence for doubt. My phone buzzed with an email. Janet Mills had sent the formal confirmation from the technology office. Leah glanced at her own phone and smiled at me with her eyes. I forwarded the note to Serena and the associate printed it on the room's machine with a sound that felt like a seal being pressed. We added it to the neat stack of proof that our house had been built on ground tested by people who knew what they were doing. Serena set both palms on the table. She said we were good to go. She said to meet back here at 11 for signatures and that her assistant would bring in the packets and the pens. She asked me if I wanted 5 minutes alone to breathe or if I preferred to keep moving. I told her I wanted to take a short walk down the hall and wash my hands and look at my face in a mirror to be sure I recognized the person who had gotten us here. We filed out and moved through a corridor lined with framed photos of companies that had once been ideas sketched on napkins. I found the restroom and stood at the sink with the water running warm over my wrists. The mirror showed a woman who looked like me but steadier, someone who had watched a piece of paper rip the night before and still came to work instead of folding. I pressed a towel to my skin and thought of the people opening their shops across Massachusetts, of ovens warming and signs flipping and small routines beginning that we intended to protect. Back in the conference room, Mia had arranged our materials with the care of a curator. Evidence pack on the left. My pen in the center. The emailed confirmations clipped to the front like armor plates. Dylan had his laptop closed, which for him was a gesture of faith. Leah leaned against the window ledge and described the order of signatures so I would not mistake the rhythm. Serena returned with her associate, and a soft click of the door announced the moment rolling toward us. We had 15 minutes until 11. In that small space of time the rush quieted, and I felt something like gratitude land in my chest and sit down. We had done the last passes. We had caught the thing that could have embarrassed us and turned it into a small story about preparation. We had pulled the chain of title tight and checked the knots. Outside a bus sighed at a stop. The city shifted another inch toward noon, and my hands felt ready. Serena's assistant brought in 2 blue folders and a metal tray with pens that looked heavier than they needed to be. We took our seats. Leah walked me through the signature sequence in a calm voice that kept my hands steady. Serena signed first where the fund committed capital, then slid the packet to me. I initialed blossoms on page after page, the letters building their own quiet backbone. 11:05 came and went in a smooth line. When we finished, Serena shook my hand with both of hers and said we were closed. Mia took a photo of the 2 closed folders side by side and whispered that noon would be soon enough for the world to know. We moved to a smaller room with a long table that looked like it belonged to a library. Mia opened her laptop and laid out the media plan like a surgeon setting instruments. She read the headline one more time in a voice that made it sound inevitable. Granite Harbor Capital leads pre-seed investment in Harbor Shield AI to protect small businesses from email fraud. She read the first 2 sentences, the kind that carry weight without puffing themselves up. She pointed to the quotes she had gathered from Serena and Prof. Ruth. She had a short line from me about building tools that help real people sleep. We reviewed the list of outlets and the order of distribution. Local business desks first, then the regional tech blogs, then the national reporters who tracked early-stage companies. Mia said timing matters. She said we were not a consumer spectacle and she did not want to feed the wrong kind of hunger. Serena agreed and reminded us that slow and precise outruns fast and sloppy when a company is still learning to stand. My phone buzzed with a short note from Dana Brooks. She confirmed the exclusive interview at my grandmother's house in Newton for the next afternoon and attached a release form and consent language. She asked for written acknowledgement that filming would be on the record and that we were comfortable with still images from the session. I forwarded the email to Leah and Mia. Leah replied that the language looked standard. Mia typed a reply to Dana with clear consent and the logistics that keep small things from becoming big headaches. She included a list of items we intended to show on camera so the crew could plan framing. Dana sent back a thumbs-up emoji and then a real sentence confirming her team would bring minimal equipment and a light that made people look like themselves. I pulled my tote closer and started to build the evidence pack the way a climber builds a kit. I slid the cap table into a plastic sleeve and marked the date in the corner. I printed the page from the bylaws that spelled out the right of first refusal and wrote a sticky note that said this is the clause that matters. I found the page with the protective provisions and highlighted the thresholds that required board consent. I tucked in the receipt for the 83B election and the certified mail stub that proved I had sent it in January. I added a printed copy of the draft license confirmation from the Institute's technology office and left a space for the final countersign note I expected before lunch. I printed the release Mia had polished and placed it behind the other documents. I pulled the photo of my torn diploma from my phone and sent it to the room's printer. The machine warmed, hummed, and then gave us the image of torn paper laid out on my kitchen table like a wound that had scabbed over. Serena glanced at the pile and nodded approval. She said evidence tells a story without raising its voice. Leah put a slim binder clip on the stack and wrote our company name along the top with the date so no one could mistake it for something else. Dylan returned from the kitchenette with paper cups and said he had checked the monitoring and everything was quiet. He offered to set up a shared folder with the same contents and a checksum list so we could prove nothing had been altered if it ever came to a question. The way his brain worked always made me feel like the floor had one more board under it. The room fell into a companionable focus. Mia sat with headphones on and trimmed the release down by 3 words that had been padding, then added a sentence about the early pilot wins without crowing. She pulled a sentence from Cassandra's email, the one where she said we saved her from sending money to a stranger. She kept it simple so it read like the way real people talk when they are grateful and tired. She prepped a post for our company page that used the same language as the top of the release, so nothing could be misquoted. At 11:42, Leah's phone lit up, and she made a small sound that could have been mistaken for a sigh if you did not know her. She handed me the screen. It was a message from Janet Mills with the subject Harbor Shield AI license confirmation final. The body said the countersigned confirmation letter was attached and effective as of March. It had the proper letterhead, the seal, and the tidy lines that make bureaucratic language feel like a guardrail. Leah forwarded it to Serena and Mia, and to me, then printed 2 copies on the room's printer. The paper came out warm and official. She slipped one into our evidence pack and the other into the fund's diligence file. That simple act felt like a knot clicking tight. Mia looked at the clock and then at me. She said at noon she would hit send to the first list. Serena asked if I wanted to make the call. I told Mia to go ahead and she nodded but did not press the key yet. She waited for my breath to match the moment. We stood together for a second in a triangle of quiet. Dylan checked the dashboard. Leah capped her pen and slid it into her bag with a small finality that made me think of a judge tapping a gavel once. We took 5 minutes to walk through what would happen after the release. Mia would field the first wave of inquiries and route the ones with substance. Serena's associate would send a short note to limited partners who'd track portfolio news in real time. I would hold a calm tone if anyone tried to pull me into a different narrative. Mia would decline any request that smelled like tabloid hunger. We would only accept questions that touched product, customers, or company structure. Leah would handle any legal inquiry. Dylan would continue to sit on the logs as if they were a lake that could ripple without warning. My phone hummed again. Dana sent the exact arrival time for the crew and asked about parking on my grandmother's street. I told her about the driveway that runs alongside the garden and the hydrangeas that would show blue in June. I told her my grandmother would probably offer them cookies and to please accept because it would make her happy. Dana wrote that she appreciated the heads up and that small favors make big days easier. Serena took a quick call in the hallway, came back and said the fund's communications person would mirror Mia's timing but not get ahead. She said we wanted to keep a single voice for the first hour. She asked if my grandmother knew why we had chosen her house, and I said yes. That house holds our family's better self. It is where I learned to read, and where I learned that if you are quiet, people will show you who they are. It felt right to stand there and speak plainly. At 11:58, the room seemed to hold its own breath. Mia hovered over her keyboard. I felt my pulse in my wrists, but it was not fear. It was the sensation of a door swinging open on well-oiled hinges. Mia tapped send for the first tier, then the second, then the third with a measured cadence as if she were laying bricks in a path. She scheduled the company post and pressed publish. Serena's eyes met mine, and she raised an eyebrow that asked, "Are you ready?" And I answered with a nod that said yes. The first responses trickled in like water testing a gutter. A local business reporter asked for a quick quote. Mia sent the sentence we had prepared. A regional outlet asked for a headshot. I sent one where I looked like myself and not like a glossy stranger. A national tech writer asked for a product demo and Mia queued that for next week with Dylan on deck. The fund's internal channel pinged with a simple welcome aboard. Prof. Ruth sent a note with a confetti emoji and a line that told me to eat real food today. I went through the evidence pack one more time, not because I doubted it, but because touching each piece steadied me. Cap table check. Bylaws with the right of first refusal check. Protective provisions check. 83B receipt check. License confirmation with seal check. Printed release check. Photo of the torn diploma tucked in the back like a scar you do not hide but you also do not let define you. Mia looked up from her laptop and told me to take 10 minutes to breathe before the next hour started to stack tasks on itself. She said the first wave of social mention was clean and that people liked stories where the tool helped an actual person save actual money. Dylan said the logs were quiet and the servers were barely idling. Serena asked if I wanted to step outside for air. We stood at the window instead and watched the ants of traffic begin to rearrange for lunch. Leah checked her calendar and reminded us of the interview time tomorrow and the list of items to bring. She said she would bring a small portable scanner in case we wanted to capture any old photos at my grandmother's house for context. She said everything on camera would be on the record and that consent had been properly documented. I felt a clean satisfaction at the words properly documented. Sometimes safety is a file folder. By 12:20 the release had done its first job and settled into the world without a mess. The phone on the conference table buzzed and stilled and buzzed again, busy but not chaotic. Mia closed her eyes for a second and smiled. Serena rolled her shoulders and let the tension spill out. Dylan relaxed into his chair and balanced his laptop on one knee like a cat. I picked up the evidence pack and felt its weight in my hands. Paper and ink and small facts lined up like soldiers. Noonlight laid a flat brightness over the table and made the folders look clean and final. The day had shifted into its next phase, and for a moment everything inside the room felt aligned. We would walk it step by step. We had what we needed. At 11 in the morning, the conference room felt like a chapel and paper became a kind of ritual. Serena signed where the fund committed and the pages made a soft sound like a hand brushing linen. The packet came to me and I wrote my name in careful strokes. Stock purchase agreement. Investors' rights agreement. Right of first refusal and co-sale. Leah guided the rhythm so I did not stumble. Dylan watched the page numbers move like mile markers on a long road. 11:05 was a small boat slipping past a buoy, and then Serena said we were closed, and that was that. She shook my hand, and I felt the tremor of something too big to name move through me and settle. Mia already had the release queued. She showed me the headline one last time, and I nodded. Granite Harbor Capital leads pre-seed investment in Harbor Shield AI to protect small businesses from email fraud. She had the figure in words so no one could misread it. $2 million. She had 3 pilot customers referenced without overpromising. She had a quote from Serena about disciplined teams and a line from Prof. Ruth that made me stand taller without realizing it. She pressed send to the first tier and then the second, and then scheduled the company post for a breath afternoon. Serena's associate stepped back in with a clean summary of board composition to include in our files. 1 voting seat held by the founder. 1 voting seat held by the fund. 1 independent observer seat without a vote until the next round. Reserved matters listed with the thresholds that keep a young company from tripping over its own feet. Leah slid the summary into our binder and wrote the date on the tab. I thanked Serena and she said see you on the other side of lunch. The first replies came in as gentle taps. A business desk asked for a quote and Mia sent the sentence we had polished. A local tech blog asked for a logo and we sent the only one we could afford to love. Dylan leaned over his laptop and said, servers at idle alerts green traffic steady. He said we might get a bump, but the architecture would yawn and ask for a snack. Then a new message flashed at the top of my phone. It was from Victor Hale, counsel retained by my parents. The subject line asked for a family meeting to discuss participation in the upside of recent developments. The body proposed that I set aside a meaningful percentage of founder shares in the spirit of unity and that I meet with them to formalize within the week. It read like a demand dressed for brunch. I steadied my breath and forwarded it to Leah. Leah read and said we would respond on letterhead and that I did not need to engage directly. She opened her laptop and began to write with that precise tone that runs cold water over hot stones. She cited the bylaws that limit transfer. She cited the right of first refusal that protects the cap table. She noted that any change of control or new class of equity would require board approval and that no such plan existed. She wrote that the company would not participate in family negotiations and that any future correspondence should be routed through counsel. She read it once to herself and then once aloud so the words could stand on their legs. I felt a quiet strength lift the room a notch. While Leah worked, Dylan frowned at his screen and then stood without moving his eyes. He said he saw a fresh session in our document portal that did not match the usual patterns. He traced the login and pointed to a user profile that had been inactive for months. The recovery contact showed an email address that belonged to my sister and a phone number I knew by muscle memory. He said the session had not yet accessed any file, but it had navigated to the diligence folder. He looked at me and waited. I told him to lock the account and capture everything. He opened a terminal and moved in that quiet way he does when the floor shakes a little. He forced a logout, rotated the token, and archived the access logs with a checksum. He took screenshots with the system clock stamped in the corner and saved them to a folder labeled with the hour and the minute. He started an internal incident report and assigned it to himself with me as the owner. He did not raise his voice or fill the air with technical theater. He did the work. Mia heard the words document portal and turned from her laptop. She asked if we needed to say anything publicly. I said no. We would not accuse or speculate. We would secure and record and then breathe. If asked, we would say the company conducts routine security hygiene and does not comment on specific users. Serena listened at the doorway and nodded once. She said teams that avoid drama make better use of capital. Leah finished the letter to Victor and sent it through her firm's system. She printed a copy for our files and wrote the time at the top. She looked at me and asked if I wanted her to call my parents' attorney directly to confirm receipt. I said yes and that I would not be available for a call of any kind with my parents today. She said that was a good boundary and that she would carry it like a shield. The release began to ripple into the world with a little more force. Our company inbox started to show subject lines that made my stomach tighten and then relax. Congratulations on the round. Could we learn more about your pilot criteria? Do you support multiple domains for a single tenant? Mia sorted with the efficiency of a stage manager and set aside only what needed my attention. Dylan announced that a national outlet had linked to our site and that the traffic graph had woken up but was still civilized. Serena came back in with a bottle of sparkling water and 4 paper cups. She said first closes can feel like standing in a busy street and realizing all the cars are braking for you. She asked if we wanted sunlight or shade and then pulled the blinds half down so no one had to squint. She asked about the rest of our day, and I told her we would return to Cambridge to regroup, then prepare for the interview at my grandmother's house in Newton tomorrow. She said the fund's communications person would echo our release and then go quiet. My fingers found the edges of the evidence pack again. I tested each document by naming it in my head. Cap table dated this morning. Bylaws with the right of first refusal highlighted. Protective provisions page. Receipt for the 83B election. License confirmation with seal. Printed release with a timestamp. Photo of the torn diploma in the back. Each item felt like a rung on a ladder that did not wobble. Dylan cleared his throat and said the portal now showed a second attempt with a different IP. He said the account was locked and would remain so. He said we might expect questions later and that he had already prepared a short technical summary with steps taken and artifacts stored. I told him to save that for our internal records and to send a separate note to our investors' security channel that simply said we conducted routine account hygiene after closing and confirmed no unauthorized access to company documents. He typed it and sent it and then leaned back like a diver who had surfaced clean. Leah's phone buzzed and she made that small sound again. Victor's office acknowledged her letter and said further communication would be through counsel only. No meeting proposed, no threat made. Just air. Leah met my eyes and I felt my shoulders lower by a fraction of an inch. We ate sandwiches someone had left in a paper bag as if the world had decided we should be human again. The bread tasted like nothing, but the act of chewing calmed my brain. Mia laughed softly at a message from Prof. Ruth that contained a confetti emoji and the words "remember to drink water." Serena took a call from a colleague and used phrases like measured rollout and quality of evidence, and I loved her for speaking in that balance of steel and cotton. I sent a short text to my grandmother telling her the papers were signed and that we would come by tomorrow with the crew. She sent back a heart and then a crooked photo of cookies cooling on a rack. The curve of warmth that moved through me at that image did not erase the morning, but it changed the light on it. The hour after the clothes slid by in work-like moves, Mia queued a handful of replies. Dylan checked the cluster again. Leah organized her bag and tucked the signed copies into their sleeves. Serena thanked us for being prepared and for not performing competence but actually practicing it. By early afternoon, the noise had softened into a manageable hum. We packed our things. I slipped the evidence pack into my tote and felt its weight the way a runner feels a baton. The lobby was cooler than the conference rooms and the marble smelled faintly of soap. Outside, taxis quickened and slowed along the curb. The sky had that pale Boston brightness that looks like chalk dust on blue. Before we stepped into the street, Dylan touched my arm and said he had set the portal to send him a text if any locked account received a new attempt. He said he would keep an eye on everything so I could think about words instead of logs. Mia tucked her hair behind her ear and told me that we would not chase every ping. We would hold our line and let the truth do what it always does when given time. We walked toward the T with that mix of fatigue and clarity that comes after a chance to prove you can stand where you said you would. My phone rested heavy in my pocket, but for once I did not feel ruled by it. The documents in my bag felt heavier in a better way. The city moved around us in its ordinary patterns, and I let the ordinary bring me down from the high wire. We had signed. We had spoken carefully. We had kept our hands on the rail. Now we would take the next step in a day that still had hours left to demand things of us. The following Tuesday brought a clean blue sky and the kind of sun that makes road signs look freshly washed. By mid-morning, we were in Worcester, parked behind Maple and Main with the back door propped by a milk crate and the kitchen humming like a small engine. Cassandra Lee waved us in with a hand that held a pencil and a to-do list. She thanked us for driving out and pointed at a corner booth by the window where we could set up. Dylan opened his laptop and checked the dashboard. Mia set her phone on the table and wrote the word calm at the top of her notes as if naming the goal could make it so. We had gone live at the diner 2 days earlier with a simple plan. Detect emails that pretend to be suppliers. Flag unusual changes to payment instructions. Guide Cassandra through verification steps that do not rely on the message itself. The system watched for patterns that sound urgent and for domains that are one letter off and for sender histories that do not match the way real vendors write when they are asking for money. Cassandra had taped our 3-step card by the register. Pause. Verify using a known phone number. Log the attempt. The lunch rush had not started when the alert pinged. Dylan looked up and said we had a match on a vendor domain that looked right at a glance and wrong by a hair. The subject line carried the invoice number from last month with 1 digit swapped. The body asked for a bank account update and attached a PDF that had the logo in the right corner but used a font that gave itself away like a tell in a card game. The timing was clever. A payment was due today for flour. The message asked for the money to be sent to a new account before noon. Cassandra was standing at the counter with a stack of plates when she felt her phone buzz. She read, frowned, and handed it to me. The header lines confirmed what our system had already seen. The sending domain was a cousin to the real one. The reply to field bounced to a different address. The tone had a hint of urgency that good vendors rarely use unless an actual warehouse is on fire. I asked Cassandra where she usually finds the number for her sales rep. She pulled a worn folder from under the counter and flipped to a page with coffee stains. She found the card and pressed the number with a finger that shook in the smallest way. A man answered and you could hear a radio in the background and a forklift beep. Cassandra introduced herself and asked if the company had changed banks. The man said no. He said their routing information had not changed in years. He checked the invoice number and said it was real but not due until next week, and not for the amount in the email. He said someone had been bothering their customers with look-alike messages and that they were adding a banner to all statements to warn people. Cassandra thanked him and hung up, and then set the phone down between us like it had become heavy. We walked through the rest of the steps with the steady pace of a fire drill that has been practiced. Cassandra forwarded the message to the vendor security address and to our report inbox. She printed the email with the full headers so we could see the path it took through the world. Dylan saved the artifacts to our case file and wrote the time on the top of each page. Mia noted the dollar amount the fraudster had requested, the language they had used to push for speed, the way the logo sat a little too high on the page. I asked Cassandra if the bank portal was open. She said yes, and that she had been about to schedule the transfer before the alert. She closed the tab with a firm click and took a breath that seemed to go all the way to the base of her spine. The kitchen kept moving around us. A cook flipped pancakes. Someone laughed at a joke we could not hear. A bell chimed for an order. We took pictures of the taped 3-step card by the register, and I realized how good it looked against the modest backdrop of a place that relies on habits and trust. Cassandra said if that money had left her account, she would have had to choose between paying rent and paying her staff on time. Her profit margin was a tightrope. A large loss would have turned that rope into a thread. We sat in the booth while Cassandra called her bank to ask about setting an alert for any new pay added to her account. The banker offered to place a note and to watch for unusual routing information. Cassandra took down the name and the time and thanked the woman on the line the way you thank someone who has helped you hold a door against the wind. When she hung up, she looked at me with eyes that were still bright with adrenaline and said I did not know a tool on a server somewhere could make my chest stop hurting. Mia asked if we could use the incident as a case study if we scrubbed account specifics and let Cassandra approve the copy. Cassandra said yes, as long as the story told the truth. She said she wanted other owners to know they were not foolish for being fooled. She said the criminals were practiced and that shame should not keep anyone quiet. Mia wrote the agreement in her steady hand and Cassandra signed with a pencil because that is what she had, and it felt perfect. Dylan pushed a small update to our advisory template so we could share what we had learned from this attempt without sounding breathless. He added a line about always verifying using a number from a past invoice and not from the message itself. He added a note about lookalike domains and the way a missing letter can cost you rent. He kept the sentences short. He said people read advice when it does not make them feel dumb. We stayed through lunch. The place filled with regulars who greeted Cassandra by name and a man at the counter who knew every waitress by the shoes she wore. We ordered omelets and shared fries and tried not to look like people working while other people ate. The alert stayed quiet and the dashboard graphs looked like calm water. Cassandra came by the table with a plate of cinnamon rolls on the house. She said they were too sweet, but it had been that kind of morning and sugar was a kindness. Mia took a picture of the rolls next to our laptop and wrote a caption in her notebook for later that made me smile. The taste of cinnamon and relief landed on my tongue at the same time. Around 2 in the afternoon, a message hit my inbox with a subject that made my throat close for a beat. Thank you from Maple and Maine. Cassandra had written a short letter for us to share. She said the tool had interrupted a bad pattern. She said her staff went home with paychecks that would not bounce. She said HarborShield gave her a way to pause and think, and that sometimes a pause is the difference between staying open and closing. Mia read it once and did not change a word. Dylan packed the case file with the printed headers and the screenshots and the notes. He labeled the folder with the date and wrote Worcester in small, even letters. He said he would normalize the data and feed any new patterns back into the detection model. He said it like he was telling us he would take out the trash, and it felt just as solid. As we walked out, Cassandra touched my arm and asked if I would be willing to speak at the small business meeting next month. The local chamber wanted someone to talk about practical steps that owners could take without buying a thing. She said she would introduce me and that the other owners would listen because they had watched what had just happened and because they trusted her. Mia looked at me and raised an eyebrow. I said yes and asked for the details. Cassandra said she would email the time and she smiled in a way that showed the morning had not defeated her. We stepped into the sunlight and the backlot heat carried the smell of fryer oil and cut grass. Dylan tilted his face to the sun and closed his eyes for a second. Mia opened her phone and drafted a short note to our list. Early pilot success in Worcester. Attack interrupted. Case study coming with the owner's consent. No drama in the words. Just cause and effect. On the drive back toward Boston, the traffic on the Pike moved like a long exhale. Mia read the letter again and asked me to think about 3 takeaways to share with owners that would not sound like marketing. I said, pause before you pay. Verify with a number you already know. Keep a simple log of attempts so you can spot patterns. She wrote them down and said that people remember 3s. Dylan pointed at a billboard and said, the cloud we rent half lives in a building near that exit. I liked the idea that our tool had a physical home you could almost wave at. My phone vibrated with a calendar invitation from the Worcester Business Association. The subject line was plain. Talk by Nora Bennett on simple defenses against email fraud. I accepted and felt a small click inside like a key sliding into a lock. There is a kind of pride that does not perform. It just sits beside you and keeps you company while you work. That is what I felt as the skyline of Boston came into view and the river picked up sunlight and scattered it like coins. Back at the apartment, we put the new documents next to the evidence pack on the bookshelf. The cap table and the bylaws and the license confirmation sat there like older siblings. The case file folder leaned against them like a child who had made it home from school with a good story. Mia sent a thank you to Cassandra with a copy of the draft case study for approval. Dylan set the advisory to go out to our pilot users in the morning. I cleaned the whiteboard and wrote the date across the top. Then I drew a small square for Worcester and filled it in with a blue marker. The room settled around us. The late daylight made the floorboards warm under my feet. Outside, a neighbor laughed on the phone, and a dog barked twice. I sat on the edge of the couch and let the sound of the city wrap itself around the quiet inside me. Nothing flashy had happened. No heroics. Just a tool doing its job and people following steps. It felt like exactly the kind of story I wanted to tell when a camera pointed our way. It felt like the kind of proof even a skeptic might respect. Mia put a kettle on and Dylan leaned his head back and closed his eyes. I checked my phone one more time. The letter from Cassandra glowed at the top of my inbox. I saved it to a folder named Letters Worth Keeping, and then I let the screen go dark. The day had given us a win that did not need to be shouted. It needed to be kept and used and told cleanly when the time came. The kettle began to build its small tornado of steam when my phone lit with a headline that prickled my skin. A tabloid site had posted a story with my sister's face taking up the whole top frame. The headline said she had co-founded Harbor Shield and had been pushed out by a timid sibling with no sense for leadership. The article was full of confident lines that did not belong to the truth. It used old photos from summers when we still stood close for pictures and spliced them with shots from my commencement day. It said a source in the family confirmed that she had sacrificed for my education and that now it was time for me to return the favor. A group text from my parents landed a breath later. The link sat at the end of a paragraph about family unity and how the public image of the Bennetts mattered more than petty disagreements. My father wrote that everything would be easier if I stopped trying to be difficult. My mother added that it was better for all of us to present a united front. I let the screen dim without touching any of it. We had a plan for this kind of noise. We had agreed to starve it. Mia set 2 mugs on the table and saw my face. She asked if it was family or press. I said both. She opened the tabloid link on her laptop and read fast without moving her mouth. She said the piece was built on innuendo and anonymous claims and that it named no documents and cited no filings. She said we would not answer to gossip. She pivoted to the plan we had written on a calm afternoon for a day exactly like this. She opened a folder labeled Media Hygiene and began to pull the right tools from it. She drafted a crisp statement for inquiries that might follow. Harbor Shield AI has a single founder and chief executive. The company does not comment on personal claims. Product and customer outcomes are our focus. She attached a 1-page fact sheet with simple points. Date of incorporation in Delaware. Assignment of inventions on file. License confirmation from the technology office with seal. Board composition after the round. 3 pilots live. She added the line about our mission being to protect small businesses from email fraud, not to entertain. She showed it to me and I nodded because not a word leaned on anger. Dylan swiveled his chair and pulled up traffic graphs. He said the tabloid used a content network that pumped clicks like a heart pushing blood. He set filters so that any spike to our site from that network would fall into a sandbox where it could do no damage. He turned on a moderation rule for our social channels that hid comments containing my sister's name or ours in the same sentence with a slur. He kept his voice level and told me the system would catch the worst of it before I had to see it. Serena called. Her voice held that unshakable middle that makes other people stop shaking. She said she had read the article and she was not concerned. She listed the reasons the fund would stay exactly where it stood. The pilot metrics were real. The license confirmation had arrived and sat in the diligence file like a stone. The extra checks we had done that morning had removed any pretense of a problem. The clause that allows a fund to walk away after a catastrophe did not touch family drama. She said we would keep building and let air leak out of the noise. Mia's inbox pinged with a note from Dana. She had seen the tabloid and wanted to confirm that it would not change our interview plan. She said she would like a short on-the-record statement from Serena for the article she was preparing so readers would not mistake gossip for signal. Mia forwarded the message to Serena and to Leah. Leah replied that a single sentence from the lead investor about diligence and confidence would be clean and useful and would not invite follow-up on private matters. Serena wrote that she would send exactly that. My parents continued to send messages. My father urged me to fix this by simply acknowledging that my sister had been part of the early vision. My mother wrote that Avery deserved credit. The thread grew longer in a way that began to feel like walking into a room and finding the same argument waiting in a different chair. I set the phone face down so I would not read the next line out of habit. Leah texted a separate note that she had archived the thread and that any further messages should be left unopened for now. It felt like a hand lifting a weight off mine. Mia sent our prepared statement to the first reporter who asked if the company had 2 founders. She also sent the 1-page fact sheet and made sure to use the same sentences each time so there would be no accidental color. She kept a calm tone, and her replies looked like they had been written by a clear day. She declined 2 requests for interviews from outlets that thrive on heat. She accepted 1 request for a 5-minute call with a local business desk and put me on for the short version because the reporter had been measured in their coverage all week. Dylan watched the dashboard and called out that the bump from the tabloid had been absorbed by the sandbox. He showed me a small hill on the graph that had already begun to sink back into the baseline. He said the system was holding. He said we should leave it to do its job. He turned the screen so I did not have to look anymore and opened a terminal to check our alerts for actual customers. There were none. Serena's email arrived. It was 3 sentences and each one did exactly what a sentence should do when many people might read it in a hurry. She affirmed that Granite Harbor had completed diligence and invested based on the strength of the team, the product, and early traction with small businesses. She noted that personal disputes are outside the scope of investment decisions. She added that the fund does not comment on the private affairs of founders. She sent it to Dana with permission to use it on the record in the article scheduled for tomorrow. Dana replied with a thank you and a note that she would quote the statement in full. Mia exhaled and marked a small check beside the line that read investor statement secured. She then drafted a short internal note to our pilot customers in case they saw the tabloid and worried. She wrote that the company was heads down on product and that their implementation and support would continue without interruption. She kept it short so it would not feel like a broadcast from a bunker. She copied me and Leah and Serena for visibility. I stood at the window and watched a delivery truck double park and unload boxes for the restaurant on the corner. The driver moved fast and efficient, and no one watching would have guessed whether his morning had held calm or chaos. I wanted that kind of skill. The ability to move through public noise without letting it enter the deeper rooms of myself. The letter from Cassandra sat warm in my mind like a small stone that had been held and held until it cooled to body temperature. That, I told myself, is the news. A neighbor knocked on our door and asked if we had seen the story about me online. Mia said we had, and that we were fine and that the kettle was still warm if she wanted tea. The neighbor asked what she should tell her cousin who followed gossip sites. Mia said to tell the cousin that small business owners in Worcester were not sending money to thieves today. The neighbor laughed and said she liked that better than drama and then went back to her hallway. Leah sent a brief confirming that the fund's material adverse change clause did not apply to family speculation on the internet. She attached a screenshot of the clause with the parts highlighted that referred to long-term harm or legal jeopardy. She said it never hurts to have a copy close at hand. She advised me not to respond to any message that used the word "oh." She had a way of turning noise into a list and then into nothing. Dana asked if we had a photo of me that did not look staged for the article. Mia found the one from the conference room where the folders sat on the table and the light came in flat and honest. She sent it with a caption that simply named the day and the act. Dana said it worked and that she would lay it next to a shot of a register at a diner with a piece of tape that read, "Pause, verify log." She said readers like to see the shape of a tool in the real world. In the late afternoon, Serena called again and kept it short. She said she had spoken to 2 limited partners who read everything and neither raised a concern. She said our job was to keep the signal strong. She asked if I was holding up. I said yes. I said the anger had come and gone and left a cleaner space behind it. She said that is what happens when you tell the truth in a way that does not try to win. The tabloid comments grew like weeds for a few hours, and then most of them burned out against our filters. Friends sent messages that said they were with me. I answered with a simple thank you and a link to the advisory we were sending to pilots in the morning. It felt better to point at work than at a fire. As evening settled, the apartment took on that gentle hum I had started to love. Dylan ran the last checks on our cluster and wrote a report that he saved to a folder named End of Day. Mia stacked the media plan pages and slid a paper clip over them as if to say this chapter can rest. I forwarded Serena's statement to my grandmother so she would not worry, and she sent back a line about courage that sounded like her kitchen smells on winter mornings. I powered my phone down to break the reflex to look. The kettle cooled. The city outside turned its face to night. Tomorrow would bring a camera to my grandmother's house and a chance to put the story in the right frame. For now, the only thing that mattered was that somewhere a diner owner had kept her money and that our names were on a piece of paper that said we had chosen to build with care. We pulled into my grandmother's driveway while the maples still held the cool of morning and the house looked like it always had in June, windows open a sliver and hydrangeas thinking about blue along the walk. Dana's car was already there with a small crew unloading a soft light and a camera in a rolling case. My grandmother met us at the door with a tray of cookies and a sheet of paper that read "Recording in Progress" in bold letters. She asked where to tape it. Dana pointed to the front door glass and thanked her, then read the consent language out loud in the entryway so no one could pretend they had not heard it. Filming on the record. Consent on file by email. Anyone who stays consents to be on camera. We each said yes in turn and nodded. Leah checked that the printed release matched the version she had approved and tucked it into her folder. Dana chose the sunlit study for the interview. The room smelled like paper and lemon oil, and the light found the old oak desk the way it always did in late morning. On the walls were photos of science fairs and a faded ribbon with my name in careful marker from a long-ago middle school contest. The crew set the light and clipped a small mic at my collar, then did a sound check with the kind of efficient calm that steadies your heart without asking. Mia arranged the evidence pack on the desk as if curating a gallery. Cap table in a sleeve. The bylaws open to the right of first refusal. Protective provisions flagged. The 83B receipt with the certified mail stub. The confirmation from the technology office with its seal. The printed release. In the back, the photo of my torn diploma face down for now. Dana sat in a chair opposite me and folded her hands. She asked about the mission in the simple way that lets people answer like themselves. I spoke about small businesses and the kind of lies that show up in inboxes when cash is thin. I talked about Worcester and the tape by the register that reads, "Pause verify log," and how a phone call to a real number can keep rent paid and paychecks from bouncing. I described the pilot and how we built our advisory so it sounds like a hand on a rail, not a lecture. Dana nodded and asked about the difference between research and a product that lives with customers. I said research changed me and building changed me again. She asked about diligence and the way a morning can test you. I told her about the old dependency we cut and the feeling of readiness that followed. The bell at the front door sounded and a shadow crossed the hall. My grandmother lifted her chin and went to greet whoever had arrived. In a breath, she was back, and behind her were my father and mother and my sister standing in the doorway of the study with expressions that had practiced themselves in a mirror. My father told the room to turn the camera off. My mother said this was a private family matter and that airing it would hurt everyone. Avery smiled at Dana and said she should hear both sides if she wanted a complete story. Dana gestured to the sign on the door and reminded them that filming was on the record and consent had been properly documented. She said anyone uncomfortable could choose to wait in the kitchen or leave. Leah added in that courthouse calm of hers that this was private property and that the homeowner had consented and that the crew was working within that consent. My grandmother stepped between the camera and my father and asked for quiet. Her voice is not large, but it carries. She told them this house was a place for truth spoken plainly and that rudeness would not breathe here. They did not sit. They stood at the threshold like people who believe doorways are where power lives. I asked Dana to keep rolling. Then I opened the evidence pack and let the papers speak. I showed the cap table dated this week. I placed the page from the bylaws so the right of first refusal could be read by a viewer who might pause the video and trace each line. I slid the protective provisions beside it so anyone could see that certain changes require board approval and that no such changes had been proposed. I set the receipt for the 83B and the certified mail stub in plain view. I placed the confirmation letter from the technology office so the seal caught the light. I set the printed release near the corner of the desk. Facts make their own music when you lay them in order. Leah explained to the camera that any transfer of founder shares is restricted by these documents and by Delaware law. She said the board would have to approve and the fund would hold a right to purchase before any third party could. She said a living trust exists as a lawful structure to protect a portion of my shares and that my grandmother is co-trustee. She said the trust does not change governance but adds a layer that resists personal pressure. She kept it simple, each word like a step you can take without slipping. Avery tried to move closer and said she had shaped the early vision and that she had a right to be named. Mia did not look up from her notes. Dana asked Avery what documents showed her involvement and whether she could provide contribution records or agreements. Avery said the nature of leadership is not always written down. Leah replied that corporate ownership is always written down and that the sizzle of a narrative cannot substitute for a filing. My mother shifted her weight and said this was cruel. My father said I was making a spectacle of my own family. My grandmother looked at him and asked whether he remembered the times I had done my homework at her kitchen table while they debated the next big idea for my sister. I turned the photo of the torn diploma face up and placed it next to the printed release that announced the pre-seed round. The camera found the two rectangles of paper touching like a before and after that needed no caption. The torn edges against the clean lines of the press page said more than I could. The room seemed to draw a breath and hold it. Dana adjusted her focus but did not speak. My grandmother reached out and touched the edge of the photo, the way people touch a scar, not to pity it but to honor its proof. My father said the diploma meant nothing compared to family unity and that I was being manipulated by people who wanted my company for themselves. Serena was not in the room to hear it, and I was glad. I said I stood by the documents and by the people who had done their work in good faith. I said I would not argue in a living room about a cap table that did not include the names being shouted at me. I said the camera could capture my refusal to frame this as a feud when it was simply a boundary. Leah addressed the viewer and explained that emotional demands do not alter shareholder agreements. She said if anyone believed they had a claim, the forum for that belief was a court, not a doorway. She said no such claim existed because there was no paper to support it. She held up the assignment of inventions I had signed at incorporation and pointed to the signature. She kept her finger there just long enough for the lens to see. My mother's eyes found the cookies on the tray, and for a second she almost smiled out of old habit. Then she remembered why she had come and asked Dana to at least leave my sister out of the footage. Dana said the footage would reflect what had happened. She said she would not indulge insults or speculation, but that presence in the room is part of the record. She asked if they wished to make a statement of their own on the record. They did not. They stood and looked at me like I had lit a match. I kept my hands flat on the desk and let the wood steady me. My grandmother told my father to lower his voice. She said the camera would not hurt him if he told the truth. She reminded him that he had torn a diploma in a restaurant and that a lens telling the truth later was a mercy. She asked Avery whether she had ever opened a repository or read a stack trace at 3 a.m. or apologized to a customer for a false alarm. Avery said leadership does not need to code. My grandmother said leadership does not lie about the past. We held in that shape for a minute that felt longer than the room. Then my father looked at the sign on the door again as if seeing it for the first time and said they would not be part of a show. He told my mother to come, and she did. Avery lingered a breath longer and looked at the release on the desk and the torn diploma beside it, and the way the light had made them equal. She turned and followed them down the hall. The crew did not move until the front door clicked shut, and the sound traveled back into the study like a small answer to a large question. Dana exhaled and thanked my grandmother for holding the room. She asked if we needed a break. My grandmother said a break would be a good idea and pressed a cookie into my hand. Leah checked the time and noted that the on-the-record portion had captured the key documents and the explanation of transfer restrictions and the existence of the trust. Mia wrote the words calm and complete in the margin of her pad and underlined them once. Dylan, who had stayed in the kitchen out of the lens, leaned in and gave a small nod that meant the house had kept its signal clean. We resumed after 10 minutes with a softer set of questions about building a company while learning to have a spine. I answered in the same tone I had used all morning. Measured. Boring to anyone who wanted heat. The camera caught my hands when I spoke about the work and the papers on the desk when I spoke about the law and the framed photo of my grandfather when I spoke about the trust that carried his pen stroke. Outside, a lawn service started a mower and then stopped. Inside, the clock on the mantel made its small, steady click. When Dana wrapped, she promised to send the cut for fact checks where appropriate and to share stills for approval. Leah thanked her and reread the consent for our files. We packed the evidence back into its sleeves and snapped the binder closed. My grandmother took my face in her hands the way she did when I was small and told me with her eyes that we had done enough for one day. The crew carried the light and the camera to the door, touching the sign that had told the truth before any of us spoke. We stood in the front hall with the smell of cookies and lemon oil and felt the quiet return like a friend who knows when to leave you to your own breathing. Morning sun slid across my grandmother's driveway like a promise, and by noon Dana had sent a link to the published piece. The headline did not flare, it walked. It named what happened in a clean way and put the work before the noise. Mia read it twice, and then once more out loud while we sat at the kitchen table eating cookies left on a plate with a paper towel tent. Leah checked the quotes against her notes and sent a short line back to Dana that said, "Thank you for treating the documents like the spine of the story." By late afternoon, the article began to move through the places where small business owners actually read. A hardware store owner in Waltham posted the link with a sentence about how he had almost wired a payment to the wrong place last winter and how a tool like ours would have saved him from the week of regret that followed. A pet grooming shop in Somerville shared the paragraph about pause, verify, log, and taped those 3 words by their register. My inbox filled with questions that sounded like neighbors leaning over fences. Do you teach the steps? Will this work with 2 domains? Can we try it without breaking our routine? Mia answered each message with a thank you and a short answer, and never once used an adjective that puffed itself up. The invitations came next in quick handoffs. The Waltham Small Business Association asked if I would speak at their breakfast meeting about the simple steps owners can take without buying new software. The Somerville Chamber asked me to share a short talk on deceptive invoices and what to watch for. Cassandra sent a note that said the folks from the Diner Association wanted a link to the advisory and would I be willing to answer 5 questions they could print in their newsletter. Each request landed with the soft weight of community interest rather than the flash of fame. It felt like exactly the direction the story should travel. Serena texted that she had time for a quick board check-in and asked if we could make room on the calendar. We set a call for that evening so the day would not drift into tomorrow without a line drawn through it. At 5, we joined a video window that framed 3 rooms in 3 parts of Boston. Serena sat by a window that held the last of the day. The independent observer joined from a quiet office. She introduced herself as Priya and said she would keep her voice light in the room because she did not vote and was here to witness and advise. Serena called the meeting to order and asked us to put the proposed media and boundary policy on the screen. Mia shared her document. The font was plain and the sentences short. We respond only with facts pulled from public documents or product metrics. We do not debate personal claims in any public forum. All statements go out from our official channels after review. We decline interviews from outlets that traffic in gossip. We route any legal inquiry to counsel. We protect customer privacy. We do not post on personal accounts about company matters. We do not name family members in any company communication. We do not quote private texts. Priya asked 2 questions that sharpened the language without changing its heart. She suggested we add a line that says we do not engage with comments that use insults or slurs and that we reserve the right to mute or block to protect our community. She also suggested a simple chart that showed who speaks to which kind of inquiry so no reply depends on who is awake. Mia added both suggestions on the spot and the policy read cleaner for it. Leah asked the board to adopt the policy by reference into our communications handbook and to authorize me to enforce it. Serena moved and Priya noted the motion in the minutes. I seconded as the founder member. Serena voted yes. I voted yes. Priya recorded that the motion carried and her name sat on the page beside the witness line. Leah read the resolution in her steady courthouse tone so the words entered the record. The act of saying them aloud made my shoulders lower. We then looked at a single page that Mia called the Family Boundary Summary. It was even simpler. I will not discuss company equity or governance with relatives outside of council and board settings. I will not attend any meeting framed as family unity if its goal is corporate control. Any correspondence from my parents or sister about the company will be archived and handled by council. I will speak to them about holidays, recipes, and weather if I choose, but not about cap tables or customers. Serena asked if I wanted that page adopted or kept as a personal guide. I said I wanted it in the minutes as a directive so I would have something to point to if anyone tried to call the boundary ungrateful. Serena moved and I seconded. The motion carried and the record took the weight. We closed the board portion and stayed on the call long enough to look at the week ahead. Mia outlined the 2 speaking invitations and asked if we should accept both. Serena said yes and reminded us to keep the talks grounded in steps, not slogans. Dylan showed a slide with a tidy graph of traffic and 1 small hill labeled tabloid that had already sunk back into the baseline. He said the sandbox had worked and that no new attempts had hit the document portal. Priya smiled and said she liked graphs that looked like calm water. After we hung up, Mia and I wrote a 1-page version of the talk for Waltham. 3 steps for when an email asks for money. Pause. Verify with a number from an old invoice. Log the attempt. We added 2 short examples in plain language. We left room for questions. We did not put a logo on the top because the point was not to sell anything in a room where people were just trying to keep their doors open. Dylan volunteered to print handouts with the steps and a checklist that owners could tape by a register or a desk. He kept the font large enough for tired eyes. Dana's piece continued to move across feeds and inboxes, not as a wildfire but as a slow burn that warmed places where it mattered. A teacher from my old high school wrote that her students were talking about starting things that help and that she wanted to show them the line in the article where I said research changed me and building changed me again. A banker in Medford wrote that he would start flagging unusual pay changes on business accounts and attach a printed card with our 3 steps. A woman who runs a florist shop wrote that she had cried when she read about my grandmother because her own grandmother kept her afloat the year she almost closed. The mini climax of the day arrived in a small room in my chest when the comments under a repost shifted. The top reply was not a fight about family. It was a hardware store owner who said he had been embarrassed for years about falling for a trick and that he felt less alone reading a description that treated him like a grown man who made an understandable mistake. He wrote that the dignity in the tone made him want to learn. Other owners chimed in with their stories and the thread stayed steady and useful. No one asked about my sister. No one repeated the word "oh." The center of gravity had moved. We formalized the policy in an email to our pilot customers so they would know what to expect if they saw chatter. We told them we would not be drawn into personal drama and that our communication with them would remain exactly what it had been since day one. Product updates, guidance. The replies were gentle nods in text form. Thanks. Sounds good. Keep us posted on the advisory. Serena sent a short note to her colleagues with the attached policy and a line that said the founder is leading with her head, which is what persists. Priya followed with a comment that said the clean handling of public noise was a positive indicator of future decision-making. It was strange to see sentences about my behavior written in a report tone and feel something like relief. Sometimes adulthood is just consent to be measured by people who wish you well. Night found us back in the apartment with the whiteboard cleared for the week ahead. Mia wrote Waltham breakfast and Somerville lunch in block letters and drew small boxes beside them like tiny mouths waiting to be fed with checkmarks. Dylan updated the advisory draft with a paragraph about a new tactic a fraudster had used in a neighboring town and set it to go out in the morning. Leah sent a calendar invite for a 10-minute end-of-day review tomorrow so small things would not stack into a large thing by Friday. I called my grandmother and told her the policy had been adopted and that the rooms we care about were talking about the work instead of the feud. She said she had known that would happen once the camera captured how quiet truth sounds. She asked what I would wear to the breakfast talk, and I said probably the dark sweater that makes me look like I slept even when I did not. She said that one looks honest. The windows were open and the city carried in the sound of a siren far away and a laugh on the sidewalk below. I let myself think about standing in a room at 7 in the morning with coffee that tastes like cardboard and owners who risk their houses every month to keep a door open. I pictured saying the words pause, verify, log, and felt the simple rightness of them. Not everything has to be grand to be important. A policy written in plain language. A talk about not sending money too fast. A line in a minute book that says the founder will not discuss company control over lasagna. Mia closed her laptop and set the marker on the ledge of the board. Dylan scrubbed his hands over his face and said he would check the logs one more time and then call it a night. The apartment settled into the usual hum. My phone buzzed with a new email from the Somerville Chamber confirming the date and asking for a 2-sentence bio. I typed one that named the company and the mission and left it at that. When I turned off the lamp, the room held that soft darkness that means you got through a hard day by doing what you said you would do. The article had found its readers. The board had given me a shield that lived on paper. The invites felt like a vote taken by people who spend their days in real work. Sleep arrived without the usual rustle. In the space before it took me fully, I pictured the taped card by a register in a diner and a hand reaching for a phone number printed on an old invoice, and I felt the quiet click of something shifting into place where it belonged. September brought a clean edge to the mornings and a sky the color of glass. By the second week, the pilots had settled into their own rhythms. Ethan Caldwell's hardware store in Waltham opened at 7 and the first email checks rolled through our system before the coffee finished brewing on his back counter. Dylan had set a new alert profile to watch for strange behavior around attachments because a quiet hunch had been tapping his shoulder. That hunch turned into a ping a little past 9. He called from his desk with a voice that made me sit up straight. A test instance in Ethan's tenant had tripped an exception in our attachment parser. Not a normal failure, and not one of ours. The stack trace pointed down into a third-party library we used to unpack file headers. The crash signature looked like an integer getting shoved where it did not belong. The triggering message had arrived from an address with no history and a subject line that sounded like a routine invoice. The payload was a file that pretended to be a receipt and was not. I pulled the incident playbook to the top of my screen. Mia closed the door and took a place at the whiteboard with a marker in her hand. Dylan duplicated the environment in our lab and fed the same file to the same code path. The failure repeated on command. He stripped the attachment down byte by byte until the smallest possible version of the trigger sat in a folder like a grenade with the pin back in. The pattern began to look like a 0-day in the library that handled a narrow slice of header logic. Old code. Lots of installations in the world. A ripe place for someone to poke. We followed our steps without speed wobble. First contain. Dylan flipped a feature flag that forced all attachments into a stricter sandbox and disabled the code path that touched the weak function. That meant a few helpful features would be grayed out for a short while. Better less convenience than a surprise. He pushed the change to our staging and then to production, with a short note in the internal log. No customer saw a blip. The set of things we allowed had become smaller by one careful notch. Second, notify. I drafted a short message to the vendor security address listed for the library maintainers. Leah reviewed the language so it carried enough detail for triage and not one word more. Dylan attached the minimal proof file and the exact crash trace and our versioning information. We offered a secure channel for further exchange and a phone number that would reach me day or night. We gave them our preference for a coordinated disclosure timeline and said we would accept theirs if it was responsible and clear. Mia added a sentence that stated no customer impact had been observed because that line would travel if it had to. Third test. Dylan wrote a guard module that would sniff for the malicious pattern in attachments and shunt them into quarantine for review. He ran regression checks until his shoulders unknot by a hair. I watched the graphs for any change in latency. The numbers stayed flat. The world did not know that a thread had been pulled and tied off in our corner. The vendor answered in under an hour with a thank you that sounded like relief. They asked for one more bit of data and for permission to involve their CERT partner for tracking. Leah nodded. We set up a call and walked through what we had seen. Their engineer recognized the function by heart and winced when Dylan read the failing offset. Old code. Familiar trap. They promised a patch under embargo and a draft advisory within days. They would handle the formal tracking number through their partner. They asked if they could credit our team in the final note. I said yes and that the name on the credit should be the company because the work had not been one set of hands. Ethan called as Mia was leaving him a message. He sounded calm and curious. He had not noticed any change except one button in our console would not light up. Mia told him we were doing some careful housekeeping to keep him safe. He said he liked it when people did housekeeping without a lot of noise. He said a customer had just paid for a rake and a box of screws and that his small world continued to turn. By noon, we had our steps laid out for the next few days. We would keep the stricter sandbox in place. We would test the vendor patch when it landed. We would write and stage our own advisory for pilots to explain what had happened without tripping fear. We would keep a log of all actions with timestamps that would stand up to anyone's questions. Serena joined a short call and listened while Dylan spoke for 5 minutes with the even pace of someone who knows the work. She said the plan was sound and that the right kind of quiet is a strategy, not a mood. Late afternoon brought an update from the vendor. They had reproduced the issue, confirmed the affected versions, and prepared a candidate fix. They asked us to run it in our lab with a set of crafted files as mean as we could invent. Dylan obliged. He wrote the sort of test that tries hard to break what it touches. The patched library took the abuse and did not flinch. We signed off and the vendors scheduled their release for first thing in the morning with an advisory to the world. They offered an acknowledgement line and the option to coordinate the timing of our own note to customers. We aligned the clocks to the minute. We spent the evening writing the advisory in language that treated readers like adults and not like a risk to be managed. A vulnerability in a common attachment parsing library might allow a crash under certain crafted input. HarborShield temporarily disabled a non-essential feature and added a guard for the pattern. No customer systems were compromised. A fix from the vendor has been tested in our lab and will be rolled out in our next update. We added a paragraph about safe handling practices that did not depend on our tool. Pause. Verify. Store questionable attachments in a separate folder and do not open them until you have checked with the sender by a known number. Mia read it out loud and cut 3 words that made it feel like a press release instead of a neighbor at your counter. Morning came with the vendor advisory live and the patch ready. I merged the update into our build, and Dylan watched the deploy like a hawk. All green. We re-enabled the feature we had grayed out, and the guard stayed in place for now because belts and suspenders are not a sin when the stakes touch other people's payroll. We sent our advisory to pilots with the same respectful tone. Cassandra wrote back in 2 minutes with a heart and the words "thanks for the heads up." Ethan forwarded the note to another owner he trusted and added 3 words that made my throat tight. These folks deliver quietly. By afternoon, a security newsletter that keeps an eye on responsible practice wrote a short piece naming the vendor, the fix, and our coordination in testing. They did not use exclamation points. They did not speculate. They credited the team that flagged the issue and talked about how this is how it should work. No heat. No blame. Just people seeing a problem and making the circle safer. A regional tech blog picked it up and wrote a paragraph that used the word "steady." That one word did more for me than 1,000 likes under a picture. The invitation arrived from a local meetup that gathers owners and engineers to talk about real-life security. They asked if I would give a talk about the mechanics of coordinated disclosure, the small decisions that keep a day from turning into a headline, the human side of telling a customer that something might be wrong, and also that you have it in hand. They said they had read the newsletter and liked the part where our advisory added steps people could use without buying anything. I said yes and marked the date on the whiteboard. Mia underlined it and wrote "keep it practical." We debriefed with Serena and Priya on a short call that evening. Dylan walked through the technical path again for the record. Leah noted the times and the language in a neat file that would live next to our other procedures. Priya said the way we handled the day told her more about our future as a company than any marketing. Serena said there will always be another hard day and that this one had ended the way she hopes they all do, with clear steps and nobody shouting. When I logged off, the apartment felt like it does after a storm that does not knock any branches down. The boards of the floor held the warmth of the day. The window showed a sky just starting to think about fall. Dylan stretched his back and said he would keep the guard in place for a bit and then remove it once he was bored by the quiet. Mia printed a copy of the advisory and taped it next to the one from June as if our wall might learn the shape of our discipline by sight. I made tea and sent a note to the vendor engineer, who had stayed an hour late on their side to ship the fix. I thanked them for the clean collaboration, and they wrote back a simple line that felt like a handshake. Good catches make better code. I thought about the chain of people who had pulled on this thread with us. The person who wrote the first version of the library years ago. The person who wrote the test that caught the regression. The person who put their name on the advisory so someone else would trust it. We all live in each other's work more than we admit. That night I sketched the outline for the talk. 10 minutes on what coordinated disclosure is. 10 minutes on how to write an advisory that helps without scaring. 10 minutes on the human part, where you call a customer and say, "We saw something, we did this, here is what you can do, here is when we will follow up." 5 minutes for questions. No slides that brag. One slide with the 3 steps for email that ask for money. Pause. Verify with a number you already trust. Log the attempt. Before I shut my laptop, I checked the dashboard one more time. The lines were flat. The alert counters sat at 0 as if they had decided to sleep early. The room carried the sound of a bus outside and a conversation on the sidewalk below. I thought about Ethan locking his door and turning the sign to closed about Cassandra, counting out her register for the night about a dozen owners. I did not know who would open an email in the morning and not have to worry quite as much. Because a fix had been cut and a guard had been left in place. The feeling that settled in me was not triumph. It was the smaller, better thing that comes when you take care of what is yours to take care of and leave the rest unbroken. October turned the trees along Somerville Avenue into small fires, and the air held that sharp edge that makes coffee taste better. I chose a cafe with big windows and a habit of playing soft music that never tried to be the main character. I arrived 10 minutes early and picked a table by the wall where I could see the door and the street. Leah sat 2 tables back with her laptop open, present without hovering. We had agreed to handle this meeting like adults and to write down anything that mattered. My parents walked in together carrying that careful posture people use when they want to appear calmer than they are. My father spotted me and lifted a hand. My mother glanced at the pastry case and then at my face. We sat. Steam from the espresso machine made small clouds and the barista called out names in a rhythm that kept the room from sinking into silence. My father said they wanted to mend things. He spoke about how families should be able to sit at the same table on holidays without walking on glass. My mother said she was tired of the internet and the opinions of strangers and that she missed Sunday dinners. Neither of them used the word apology first, but the shape of it sat between us like a new object we were deciding whether to keep. I said I was willing to listen. I said I had conditions that were not negotiable. I placed a thin folder on the table the way you place a plate you do not want to drop. A family boundary agreement drafted by counsel written in plain language. I told them it was meant to protect all of us from repeating the same argument in new rooms. I said signing it would not fix every bruise, but it would stop new ones. My father stiffened at the mention of counsel. He said bringing lawyers into family matters felt like a cold way to live. I said pretending we did not need rules had not worked. I slid the summary page toward them. Respect all professional decisions without interference. No contact with investors, board members, customers, or staff. No public or private statements that misrepresent ownership or control. Correction of past false statements with the same reach as the originals. A direct apology to my grandmother. All company-related communication funneled through counsel. Personal conversations welcome if they are about ordinary life and not the company. My mother read each line with her finger. She asked what correction meant. I said any public post and any message sent to extended family that claimed my sister was a co-founder or implied a right to my shares needed to be retracted in writing with a note that the claim was incorrect and would not be repeated. I said it could be polite. It had to be clear. I watched her mouth twist and then flatten. My father said he could agree to stay out of the company, but that requesting an apology to my grandmother felt theatrical. I said my grandmother had stood between their anger and my work with more grace than they deserved, and that, acknowledging that fact in her kitchen was the smallest possible act of repair. I told him the wording was his to choose. I told him I would not script his remorse, I would only insist it happen. He looked toward the door as if the street might offer him an easier exit. Then he looked back and asked whether signing meant we could start over. I said signing meant we could stop making the same mistake. Starting over would come later if it came at all. My mother put her hand on the folder and said she wanted to see the full text. I nodded toward Leah. Leah approached with a printed copy and a calm nod and returned to her table. My parents read in a shared silence that felt like a bridge building itself an inch at a time. When they finished, my mother's eyes were wet in that way she hates, and my father's jaw had lost some of its stubborn set. He said he could sign if I agreed to meet for coffee once a month to speak about life that is not work. I said yes with the understanding that a single sentence about the company would end the meeting and push the next coffee out a month. He accepted the boundary without a smile. Leah joined us to walk through the document. She pointed to the clause that routed company-related contact through counsel. She explained that this protected them too because it kept heat out of text that could be screenshotted and misread. She highlighted the section that barred outreach to investors and customers. She spoke in the same tone she uses in front of a judge, not to intimidate, but to make sentences hold still. My parents asked a few questions that revealed ordinary confusion rather than defiance. Then they nodded. There was one more piece I needed to place on the table. I told them that Victor had been copied on the draft, and that he had an opportunity to withdraw every letter that suggested I owed anyone stock or control. I said I could not move forward while a threat lingered on firm letterhead. My father winced and said he would handle Victor. My phone buzzed on the table with a message from Leah's office. She opened it and showed us the short note that had just arrived. Victor retracted prior communications, acknowledged the company's governance, and confirmed that no further demands would be made. The timing felt like a door pushed gently from the other side at the moment you reached for it. We signed the agreement with the cafe's ballpoint pens that left small globes of ink on our names. Leah gathered the pages and said she would file them and send executed copies before dinner. A part of me that had been tight since May loosened a notch. The room felt less like a stage and more like a place where people drink coffee. My mother asked about my sister without saying her name. She wanted to know whether I would be willing to speak to her. I said I would speak when the false claims had been corrected and not before. I said integrity is not a family group project. My father looked down at his hands and then admitted something that sat between confession and complaint. A partner had walked away from my sister's latest venture after the tabloid piece and the retraction requests that followed. He said they had advised her to post a correction and remove statements that named her as my partner. He said she was furious. That was the shape of karma I had expected, not a catastrophe that ruins a life, but real consequences that teach. We did not gloat. I asked whether she had posted the correction. My mother nodded. She said Avery had deleted 2 posts and published a line that said she was not a founder of my company and regretted any confusion. The words tasted like chalk in my mother's mouth, but they were words on a page and they would do. We sat another 10 minutes in the soft noise of the room and let the formal thing we had done settle in. The barista called a name and a baby somewhere near the window laughed at the foam on a lid. My father said he had not intended to rip my diploma that night at the restaurant. He said the sound of it had been ringing in his head for months. He said he was sorry for that, not as part of a negotiation but in the plain way a person admits a wrong. It was not eloquent. It was enough to move the needle inside my chest half a mark. We stood. My mother hugged me in that careful way mothers hug grown daughters when the future is not guaranteed to be easy. She said she would call my grandmother and ask when she could bring flowers and words. I told her to pick hydrangeas if the market still had them. My father shook Leah's hand and thanked her for being the adult in the room none of us could be. Leah accepted the thanks with a small smile that did not linger. Outside, the wind felt like the first honest cold of the season. We walked to the corner in a loose group and then turned in different directions like a school of fish breaking formation. Leah and I headed toward the car. She handed me a copy of the signed agreement and told me to put it in the same place I kept the license confirmation and the bylaws page. She said paper is not love and it is not forgiveness, but it is a way to keep people safe when they forget who they want to be. I slipped the document into my bag and felt the reliable weight of it beside my hip. On the drive back, Somerville's brick buildings looked as if they had been scrubbed by wind. Mia texted a single question mark, and I sent a photo of the signature page. She replied with a green check and a heart, and then a string of logistics about the lunch talk the next day. Dylan sent a screenshot of a quiet dashboard and 3 words that I had come to think of as his blessing. All lines flat. At home, I set the signed agreement on the shelf next to the binder where we keep the company proofs. Cap table. Bylaws with the right of first refusal. Protective provisions. 83B, receipt. License confirmation with seal. Now a family boundary in writing. The stack did not look like love. It looked like a railing on a staircase, something you can hold when your balance wobbles. I brewed tea and stood at the window. People on the sidewalk wore jackets for the first time since spring. A woman hurried past with a bouquet of something white wrapped in paper. The scent of it drifted up and mixed with the city's colder breath. I thought about my grandmother's kitchen and the sound the door would make when my parents stepped over the threshold to apologize. I thought about Avery typing a correction into a box on a screen and deciding to press publish. I thought about how sometimes the most merciful thing you can do is not step aside from consequences but also not push anyone into them harder than gravity already will. The room grew quiet in that early evening way apartments do when the sun decides it has somewhere else to be. I put the agreement into the binder and closed the metal rings with a clean click. My shoulders felt an inch lower. No parade, no triumph. Just a line crossed and a weight put down. I sat on the couch and let the low light flatten the edges of the day. Tomorrow there would be questions from owners who wanted to learn and I would give them steps that worked. Tonight, I let the new shape of my life sit with me, not demanding anything, simply existing, like a room that finally fits the furniture you own. December laid a thin frost over Boston and the mornings smelled like wood smoke and coffee. By the time the lights went up on holiday windows, most of our pilots had turned into paying accounts. It did not feel like a drum roll. It felt like a quiet vote. Ethan's monthly invoice cleared with a tidy note that said the rakes were sold out and the screws kept moving. Cassandra sent her first payment with a short line about a long weekend and a full diner. Omar's grooming shop in Somerville added a second domain and asked for a training call for new staff. Our billing dashboard showed its first shallow curve, and I watched it the way you watch a sapling take hold in cold ground. Annual recurring revenue is a phrase people toss around in rooms with glass walls. To me, it looked like sleep for people who had been tired for a long time. Serena and I sat at a high table in a co-working space near South Station and sketched the first shape of a seed round. She drew boxes for what matters: team, product, traction, path to 100 customers you would want in your phone forever. She wrote in her calm handwriting that investors remember the way you handle hard days more than the way you describe easy ones. Priya joined us for tea and kept an eye on the corners of the plan where optimism likes to hide. Leah sent a neat list of tasks that would keep the next raise clean. Refresh the board consent. Update the option pool. Make sure every contractor has signed the same straight paper. Dylan added a line in his small print about scaling the cluster if our next 10 onboards all chose the same week to go live. Mia taped a sticky note to my laptop that said, "Remember to eat." The Harbor Shield wall at our apartment had changed shape. Next to the cap table and the bylaws and the license confirmation, a new frame held a letter from the Worcester Business Association that thanked us for a talk that did not make people feel stupid. Under it sat a photo from the meetup where I spoke about coordinated disclosure, and a small sign by the podium read, "Speak plainly." The evidence pack lived on the shelf like a discreet guard. The signed family boundary agreement sat behind it, not to be displayed, just to be there. The scholarship named for my grandmother took its first breath the second week of the month. We set it up for young women in tech who had been told they were too quiet for the spotlight and not aggressive enough for leadership. My grandmother helped read applications at her kitchen table with a blanket over her knees and a pencil that left soft marks on the margins. The first award went to a student from Dorchester who worked nights at a pharmacy and wrote essays in the breaks between customers. The second went to a community college transfer who had built a simple phone scam detector for her aunt and did not think it counted as real engineering. We sent the letters and my grandmother cried in that way that makes everyone in the room cry. She baked cookies the next day and said the year had been worth it for this alone. At the same time, my family learned how to live with the new rails. My parents kept their promise. They apologized to my grandmother in her kitchen while she stood with her hand on the back of a chair. I did not stand in the doorway to watch. She told me later that the words were stiff at first and then easier, like a lock that turns when the grit shakes loose. We began to meet for coffee once a month in a place that did not put anyone on stage. We talked about the weather and about my mother's basil refusing to die on a windowsill and about my father trying and failing to enjoy decaf. When a sentence reached for the company, I let silence sit on the table until the reach ended. Avery posted the correction, removed the false claims, and moved on to something else with an investor who wanted her for who she was, not for who she said she had been in my story. There were no declarations of peace. There was a truce that did not leak held up by paper and practice. The community event came on a Saturday afternoon in a hall in Jamaica Plain with wood floors that creaked and a stage that looked like it had introduced 100 choirs and 100 neighborhood plays. The banner above the back curtain said Winter Gathering, and underneath it someone had painted in careful letters a small line. Work that helps is worth applause. I stood behind the curtain with my notes in my hand and felt my breath move like it had learned to obey me. Mia stood in the wings and squeezed my shoulder. Dylan took a seat up front with a notebook that had a grid of dots and a pencil that did not smudge. Leah kept to the side aisle, half watching the door like the grown-up she always is. Serena leaned on the back wall with her arms folded and that half smile that says, "Speak softly and let the facts carry you." My grandmother sat in the second row wearing her winter coat open like a cape and a string of pearls she only takes out for weddings and days she calls important. The host introduced me in a sentence that named the work without naming the noise. I walked into the light and the room did its warm murmur and then held still. I talked about the shape of a year. I said I had learned to put railings on stairs because a fall teaches you to love a simple thing like a steady hand. I told a story about being a student who thought code would be the only language I needed, and then learning that grace and paper and timing are languages too. I talked about the diner that did not lose its rent, and the hardware store that laughed and locked up at night, and the grooming shop that taped 3 words near their register. Pause. Verify. Log. I spoke about the way a lie hides in a hurry and the kind of courage it takes to slow down. I talked about the morning a third-party library turned into a lesson and how coordinated disclosure made the circle safer without a scene. I said nothing about gossip sites and everything about the sound a fact makes when it sits still for long enough to be seen. I mentioned the scholarship by name and how a small grant can feel like someone tapping your shoulder and saying keep going. I said the names of 2 students and told the room they would build things that help strangers breathe a little easier. In the middle of the talk, I felt the old torn paper in my chest not as a wound but as a scar that had taught me where my skin ends. I told the room that I had thought revenge would feel like a door slamming. It turned out to feel like a door opening to rooms I wanted in the first place. It felt like watching people who take care of their block take care of each other with tools we tried to make sturdy. It felt like a holiday table where the conversation stays in the lanes you chose together. It felt like handing a scholarship letter to a woman who thought she needed permission to be what she already was. When I finished, the applause sounded like the inside of a good kitchen, pans warm and voices bright. The host asked for one question, and a man in a blue sweater asked what he should tell his wife, who runs a small dance studio and hates computers. I told him to print the 3 steps and tape them by the desk. Pause before you pay. Verify with a number you already know. Log the attempt so next time you can see the pattern. He wrote it down and nodded like a person who had just realized that a thing he feared might be less complicated than he thought. After the event, people lined up not to take photos but to tell me small stories. A florist who almost clicked on a link. A baker who now calls every vendor before changing a number. A teacher who wanted to bring a lesson into a classroom where kids still believe the internet tells the truth because it likes them. A mother who said boundaries had saved her marriage. A grandfather who said he was proud of his granddaughter and the way she could reset a router without swearing. I listened and I let myself feel the way the year had rerouted my sense of who I was doing this for. We ended the day at my grandmother's house with soup that tasted like ginger and a loaf of bread that cracked when you tore it. She handed me a flat package wrapped in paper she had saved from last year. Inside was a new frame. On one side, she had placed the photo of the torn diploma, now matted in a pale gray that made the rip look like a part of the design. On the other side, she had placed the license confirmation with its seal. Underneath, she had written in small letters with the old pen, "Take what tried to break you and make it hold your proofs." I hung it by my desk when I got home, and the room felt like it had taken a deeper breath. On a quiet night later that week, Serena and I sat with the seed outline again and turned the page on the calendar. January would bring new conversations and the careful work of letting strangers become partners without letting them into rooms they had no business in. We practiced the sentences we would say. We crossed out 2 words that sounded like bets and replaced them with words that sounded like plans. Priya would sit at the table and Leah would sit near the door, and I would keep my hands flat and my voice level. Dylan would keep his logs and Mia would hold the press at a respectful distance. It would take a village and a spine. Boston's river looked like hammered metal and the lights on the bridges blinked the way they always do when the cold decides to stay. I thought about the girl I had been a year ago standing in a restaurant with a ripped diploma and a decision to make. I thought about the woman I had been this fall writing a boundary into existence with a ballpoint pen in a cafe. I thought about the people who had stood next to me when it mattered, and I wished for everyone in the room I had just left to have at least one person who would stand that way for them. If you have listened to this and felt a hand on your shoulder where you needed one, I hope you will tell me about the boundary you drew and the way it held when the wind came. Share the moment you chose to pause and verify and log instead of rushing. If you know someone who needs to hear that success can be quiet and firm and still count, send this to them. And if you want more stories about women who refuse to shrink and choose to build, leave a comment, tap like, and subscribe so this small circle of steadiness can get wider.